right. All right, everybody, welcome to our October Lunch and Learn. Our topic is about the impact of domestic violence on child development. And I'm so happy to have Dr. Angie Hattery back. She presented to us last October. And this year she has a co-worker with her, Maria Mendoza, who's with her as well. So ladies, I'll kind of turn it over to you and have you kind of introduce yourselves a little bit and then, take it from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Lauren, for having us back. It's nice to see all of you again on Friday the 13th. So, fingers crossed, at least we're in the same space together. So thanks for having us back. Because we're hoping to show this video and it's about 14 minutes, I don't want to take up too much time at the beginning. We want to dive right in, but I'm a professor of women and gender studies at the University of Delaware, and I also co-direct the Center for the Study and Prevention of Gender-Based Violence. And I'm going to toss it over to Maria Paula for a brief introduction.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for letting me join today. So I am a current graduate student at the University of Delaware with Angie. I'm getting my PhD in sociology, and I'm a graduate researcher for the Center for the Study and Prevention of Gender-Based Violence. And so I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
Awesome. And we're going to dive in. So I'm going to share my screen, which we've already done 500 times in practice. And there we go. We'll just get to present mode. All righty. There we go. So everybody can see this. Yes. Awesome. Now if I can just make the slides move. So we've already exhausted our time for welcome and introductions. We're going to dive in. We're going to try to compress the sort of discussion on the PowerPoint to save room for the slide for the video. But if we can't make it work, we'll have a backup plan. You'll get the slides and a copy of the video when the recording is done. And I think Lauren, you already sent the PowerPoint, so people will be able to see it. And have some discussion. We mostly, we want to give some information and hear from you because you all are the ones on the ground doing the work. So here we go. So ACEs, maybe you could even, I can't really see everyone, but show of hands if this is a familiar concept. Yeah, for some of you not. So I'm not an expert in ACEs, but I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about what they are and why it's important when we think about especially the impact of domestic violence on kids. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and they fall into the three buckets that you see on the screen in the PowerPoint. So abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. As you can see, abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. You may or may not have children that you're working with who have one or more of those experiences. My hunch would be that if they aren't experiencing physical abuse, they've probably experienced neglect, or they wouldn't necessarily be in the system. So also in the neglect bucket, you have physical neglect and emotional neglect. And I'm imagining you all really know what that is. Neglect is, perhaps not intentional. Sometimes it is intentional, but not having our needs met physically, materially, in terms of food, clothing, shelter, but also emotionally. So parents who are unavailable, who are emotionally detached, what we think a lot about is parents who aren't meeting the emotional needs of their kids. So parents who, for whatever reason, are unable to respond and be attentive when kids are, in general, just growing up, but also if they're experiencing something that's troubling or challenging or potentially harmful. And then we have this big bucket of household dysfunction. And this big bucket holds all the kinds of other things that might be going on in our household. So living in a household with someone who's got severe, perhaps an untreated mental illness, having a relative who's incarcerated, and mother treated violently. This is the symbol for witnessing abuse in your household, which is really what we're going to talk mostly about today. Substance abuse in the household, divorce, or other kinds of instability. So this bucket is really about things that are happening not necessarily directly to the child, but are present in the household where the child is living or being raised. And the way that people use the ACEs is to basically administer a checklist and count up how many of these adverse childhood experiences a particular child is experiencing. And you might have a good sense, and we're eager really to hear y'all's thoughts. Probably you have kids who have more than one of these things going on, right? So if there's abuse going on in the household, it might partly be a result of a caregiver who is struggling with mental illness or substance abuse. It might be that as a result of the abuse, someone's incarcerated. So these coexist a lot. And unfortunately, when people, I'm going to move to the next slide. If I can make it move, let's see. There we go. When somebody is experiencing multiple adverse childhood experiences, so multiple ACEs, it increases that person's risk for problems and obstacles in adulthood. So what it really is a scale, and people who are experiencing more than 3, 4, or 5 ACEs are likely to have these adverse experiences that last into adulthood. So they may have trouble graduating from high school, completing education, trouble with jobs and holding a job, getting a job, holding a job, engaging in behavior that might be partly self-medicating, but ends up producing problematic outcomes later. So their own drug and alcohol abuse, unsafe or risky sex practices, exposure to sexually transmitted diseases, unintended pregnancy, complications from those unintended pregnancies, a lot of mental health, adverse mental health conditions associated with kids who grow up experiencing a lot of chaos and dysfunction in their household. And the one that I want to just mention here, you might be asking, why would people be more likely to experience cancer or diabetes? And the link there really is that the exposure to these traumatic experiences, to the chaos that's happening in the household, often results in a lot of sort of a dump into people's bodies around stress hormones. So cortisol, adrenaline, and if those things aren't resolved in the body, and those of you who do trauma work know this, if those things aren't resolved in the body, they can result in autoimmune disease later on. So if kids are experiencing a lot of stress, this can produce all kinds of outcomes in adulthood. And I would add to that what's not in the ACEs but compounds the ACEs are all the stresses of our identities and positions in society. So if I'm Black, Latinx, a woman, in the LGBTQ plus community, poor, any of a religious minority, all those things are also going to compound the impact of those ACEs and make the probability of adverse adult experiences more likely. So ACEs are really an important way that we're focusing on specifically the ACE that is a result of witnessing domestic violence or experiencing domestic violence, but it's important to understand that they all work together. I am going to toss it over to Maria Paula.
Yes. So here, we have a figure here that describes essentially the relationship between being abused in childhood and also being a part of an abusive, intimate relationship in adulthood, particularly for girls. And so here, similar to what Angie was saying, this figure is not it's not insinuating that it's predictive. So being a victim in childhood does not necessarily mean you will be part of an abusive relationship in adulthood. However, there is an association, and it does increase girls' risk of being a part of abusive relationships in adulthood, and thus it's important to examine. And so here, this figure shows that for girls who were abused in childhood, about 50% went on to be in abusive relationships as adults, while for girls who were not abused in childhood, they were much less likely to be in those abusive relationships. And so here, overall, it's important to emphasize the ways in which that childhood experiences obviously have both short-term and long-term effects that go on to affect adulthood experiences. We wanted to point that out. And I think for the next slide, we also have more for boys. We have the experience of adulthood or of childhood abuse. And so here, one thing Angie and I talked about, a big takeaway from this lunch and learn is the way in which the impact of witnessing abuse and not necessarily experiencing their own abuse also harms children. And so we feel as though it's often been left out in discourse. And so just emphasizing the ways in which that not only does child abuse and or experiencing domestic violence in the home impact future experiences, but also witnessing that violence? As here we have the statistic that shows that boys who are quote unquote silent witnesses, which we'll get more into in the video after this, but boys who grow up as silent witnesses to domestic violence and to abuse in the childhood are 3 times more likely to perpetrate abuse in adulthood. And so this overall just shows that just because maybe they're not experiencing abuse first directly, so they can hear the abuse, they can hear screaming, they can hear, they can all feel the tension in the household and have that sense of fear. And so just because they're not necessarily experiencing the abuse or maybe seeing it directly, maybe they're in a different room, that still is impactful on the child. And so obviously we need to both identify how these children that maybe are not directly experiencing abuse are affected as well.
So let's see, I'm going to stop the share, and I'm hoping really that we're going to have a lot of conversation. I'm going to try one more time to see if we can get the video working. Sorry, now I have not even the right things open. It is Friday the 13th. Let's try that. There we go. We're going to try one more time. And if this does not work, then Lauren's going to play it on her phone. So fingers crossed, unless you want to hear it off Lauren's phone. Here we go. Anybody hearing any noise?
No.
No. Okay. All right. I'm sorry.
If I go like this, can everybody hear?
Lauren, this is Karen. There's a little button at the bottom when you share screen. It says share your audio to. I wonder if you click that little button.
Oh my gosh, there is the share sound button that Maria Paula was teaching
I couldn't find it. Do you see it, Angie?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
If I click it, it should work, right?
Thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Karen, you're a lifesaver.
Yeah, you're a lifesaver.
Thank you. All right, let's see now though. All right, are we ready?
Ready. Karen, you win.
Give that person a prize.
Yeah, your salary just doubled.
Because of the way the brain works, you will always remember your very first roller coaster ride. Storing these new experiences is one of the brain's main jobs. In fact, your brain creates a mental blueprint of every new experience you have. A blueprint for any new touch is stored in one part of the brain. A blueprint for any new sound in a different part. And a blueprint for any new sight in still another part. But as powerful as that first roller coaster ride was, it can't compete with the lingering effects of your brain's earliest experiences. Although you have no conscious memory of this part of your childhood, it is these very first experiences that literally become the building blocks for your whole life.
Unlike other organs, the brain is undeveloped at birth, and it is waiting for experiences to shape how it will develop. The amazing thing about the human brain is that the younger you are, the more sponge-like your brain is, which is the reason that children in 3 years can learn language, can learn to walk, can do all kinds of incredible things. But the very same biological sponginess that allows us to rapidly acquire language is also the same sponginess that makes young children more vulnerable to trauma than older children.
We have the opportunity to do police ride-alongs to a domestic violence situation, and so this was actually the first call I ever rode along. It was dinner time, and they were having spaghetti for dinner. It was dripping down the walls, the kitchen table was overturned, and we had 3 children in the household. Looking at this whole situation at the time, we said, no evidence of physical harm, the kids are fine. We learned differently, of course. The boy in the corner was classic behavior that we see with kids who have had chronic exposure to violence. He would just completely zone out, numb out as things started to get scary. The 6-year-old little girl on the chair blames herself for what's going on, but actually it was 4 years later that we really appreciated who had some of the most profound or severe harm coming out of this situation, and that was the 6-month-old baby who was now 4.5 and had seriously injured another child in preschool.
It's literally the opposite of the way most people think about this. Most people think young children, they don't really understand what's going on and they're resilient. But the fact is, if anybody's impacted more severely, it's the younger child.
The brain is put together like building blocks in a sense. Those first blocks that go together are the more primitive area, the survival brain.
The brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out, so that the normal development of the top part of the brain depends upon healthy development of lower parts of the brain. The top part of the brain, where you do all of your thinking, is the part of the brain that is most changeable, easiest to modify. But unfortunately, if a child has developmental experiences of threat and exposure to domestic violence, the lower parts of the brain will be impacted and they're harder to change as they get older.
He was never physically abusive, but he was verbally abusive. There was lots and lots of screaming in front of the kids, berating, putting me down, and they pretty much heard it all.
Children exposed to domestic violence, children who witness their parents fighting, literally are experiencing a state of fear. And when this happens, the systems in your brain that are involved in thinking at the top part of your brain are literally shut down. It changes the brains of these children.
My son has seen and heard a lot of the violent outbursts. He was experiencing night terrors, and that was probably his way of dealing with it, because in his waking state, he didn't know how to articulate at 2.5 years old. So it was coming through, when he was asleep.
When kids are chronically stressed, one of the problems that we see is difficulty in attachment, in bonding, because they're so focused on survival. It's hard for them to reach out and connect with others.
My oldest boy went through a stage where he would bully his younger brother and seemingly laugh in glee. He was not remorseful or had no empathy that he could actually make someone cry. Many phone calls of him being disruptive in the classroom. He was a very bright kid, but that's when I knew that he was heading toward trouble.
A lot of these kids get labeled as being, bad, difficult, defiant. This is a very natural response to their circumstance. What the child is doing is a survival strategy for them, but it creates behaviors that are very difficult in the classroom. When they're in a crisis mode, they can't learn.
The tragic reality of children growing up in domestic violence is that they end up with mental health problems at a rate higher than children who are actually the direct victims of physical abuse.
My mother was a victim of domestic violence. My father was an alcoholic, a drug user, and it's just a cocktail for a bad living environment for children. My brother, he looked like he was crying on his way home. Me not knowing, I was just a careless little 6-year-old, seeing him climb up to my mom's medicine cabinet. I asked him what he was doing. And he boldly said, I'm killing myself. 8-year-olds don't talk like that. The first person I got the call was my best friend's mom. By the time she came down to our apartment, he had a butcher knife in his hand. He was just cutting himself all over his body. And I was just bawling, just crying. There was nothing I could do to help. My brother was crying. He didn't want to be there. He was trying to run out. But I had already known that my home, wasn't my home. It wasn't a place where I felt safe.
Childhood exposure to violence is about living in a threatening, scary environment that may escalate to physical violence, but it often doesn't have to. It's the chaos, the uncertainty, the fear of being in a home where things aren't okay. Very interesting talking about the roller coaster because that's what we hear from adult survivors who are in violent households and also the children. The hard part for them, I think, is thinking about what is normal instead of this up and down life of being in a violent, threatening relationship.
Growing up in my home, there were 6 children. My mother and father, unfortunately, fought like cats and dogs. As a result of that, 2 of my brothers ended up being batterers. I have 2 sisters. Even today, they date men that batter them.
Exposure to violence is a lifetime legacy. We see that adults who have had negative childhood experiences often have coping behaviors that can be unhealthy. That certainly has huge effects on how one is going to parent.
It's really important for parents to understand that their internal state, whether it's calm or whether it's alert engagement or whether it's frustration and anger, whether it's sadness, depression, the baby absorbs these internal states.
I have been in the moment with that sense of helplessness and hopelessness and stress and anxiety and rage. It really damages the brains of small children to be under a constant level of stress and anxiety. Every day I hope that I haven't damaged my kid in any way.
They need to see from you as a parent how to deal with stressful situations in an appropriate manner. Being rational, not resorting to violence to deal with situations. Your children are going to learn how to deal with stress from you.
Luckily, my older son is verbal enough and is old enough now that we have conversations about how did it make you feel when that was going on? Was that scary for you? Yeah, and validating that.
The biggest thing that helps children exposed to violence is to be able to talk about their feelings, get those critical messages. It's not your fault.
Any conflict, I'm able now to stop before I add to it. I'm able to step away rather than trying to solve it at that moment in a state of heightened anger.
Just try not to go through it alone. If you have a strong support system and know what avenues you have available to you, in case you do need to get out. I was glad that we got help when we did.
One of the great things about brain science that we've learned is till the day you die, you have the ability to add new neurons in your brain, that the brain is more like skin in the sense that it can rewire and heal itself in the most important area, the cortex. We have the capacity to heal and do better. The biggest thing we can do for kids exposed to violence is how many healthy adults can they connect to.
I did a lot of my childhood in other people's homes, so I saw what positive relationships were about. I saw my friends were normal, they didn't have the rage I had. Seeing parents that were together, that showed affection. Home dinners where everybody sat together. Those are the things that I realized were important, and instead of being envious, I incorporated it into my life. I wanted to be a part of that.
I know school is what made a difference for me. The teachers, the attention I got, letting me know that I could be somebody and I could do something.
In fact, my oldest son, his teachers, all 6 of them were very instrumental in coming forward and providing him support when he needed. They allowed him to be homeschooled to give him time to heal.
The hardest part about being a parent now is trying to be different than how my parents raised me. Am I being a good father? What do I need to do to help you feel safe in your home?
That's the part, the brain development part, that I think we want him to know what normal is for us. And normal is having people who support you and who love you and who want to take care of you. And that we want that to be his normal life.
It's one of those pay me now or pay me later. And the truth is, children who are good at self-regulation, good at self-soothing, don't cry very much, and end up being, if you will, successful, are children who have had incredibly attentive early caregiving, which some people, unfortunately, think of as spoiling. It's exactly the opposite. Rather than spoiling the newborn, what you're doing is you are building in healthy self-regulation.
So those are the things that I want to create an environment for my baby where he gets the benefit of what I've learned from all these experts and also other parents. And believe me, they're experts too.
The most important thing that parents need to understand is that the brain of their child will become exactly what the child was exposed to. If you want your child to be kind, then you have to be kind to your child. If you want your child to be good at self-regulation and not lose their temper, you have to not lose your temper. And that's the beauty of the human brain. It is a mirror to the child's developmental experience.
All righty. Let me see if I can get back to the PowerPoint, which is really, let me see. Oh my gosh, all this stuff. Let's see, I'm not in. Let me just stop the share real quick. Really, where we are at this point is opening it up for discussion. So I can show you the next pretty slide, but really where we are is let's chat. Let's hear from you. What's resonating? What's not resonating? What are your experiences? Where do you want to dive in more?
This is Beverly Flanagan. Beverly Flanagan.
Yeah, go for it, Bev.
Okay, hi, how are you? I've been accosted for quite a long time, and I usually don't get the severe neglect cases. Usually, all of my cases are babies that are left at the hospital because they were drug positive. So I don't see what you're talking about here, but I just got my very first case where it was severe neglect for a 6-year-old. And is it okay if I describe some of it?
Very, very vaguely.
Very vaguely?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. She was 6 years old. She had never been enrolled in school. She was rarely bathed, and her hair was never washed. It was actually matted and stuck to her scalp. And they had to shave it. It was very painful. All of her teeth were rotten, and some other things. That describes enough of it. So the social worker went to the house. They took her. They put her in the care of her 23-year-old sister. She was the oldest child in the family. The parents should only be having supervised visits with this little girl. But I have to tell you, the thing that just blows my mind, and I can't understand, is why this little girl who had so much pain through these parents just cries because she misses them, and she cries when they come, she cries when they leave, and she pleads with them to take her, and I can't wrap my head around that.
Yeah. Do other people have thoughts about that, or that experience? Is that resonating with folks? Anybody want to? I mean, I'm certainly happy to weigh in a little bit, but you all are the ones sort of in the trenches doing the work. Other folks have thoughts or comments.
This is Sheila Davis. Sometimes the child would look at that as love and not realize that it is abuse because they don't know anything better. So
Okay.
that's the reasoning why.
Okay.
Yeah, there's some
Thank you.
comfort in the known.
I've noticed that my cancer child will demand any attention and prefers negative, and is now getting to the stage where he has to be constantly held down in classroom. It's getting worse and worse and worse. He's so aggressive. So yes, any attention, because he hasn't ever very much been given positive attention.
Thank you.
I think if we think about the video, one of the messages is sort of chaos and the lack of stability, and that's really what the ACEs tell us. But I think perhaps that what you're seeing, Beverly, is the most stable thing might still be those parents, right? Even though we look at that as neglect and abusive behavior, that still might be the most stable thing. And so kids might, be wanting to hold on to the thing that is stable, even if it's not necessarily healthy.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, thank you all for what you do, right? Like, thank you.
We have a comment in the chat that says, I think children have a deep love for their caregivers and usually bond to who they are around most, even if the parents need to learn how to better care for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And in the video, I guess one takeaway or one thing that I wrote down that I thought it kind of stuck with me is when they said that the child needs to see, they need to see how to deal with stress without violence and abuse. I think when the young man was at his friend's house and they were having dinner, so he got to see something different from what he was used to seeing. So he got to see that it could be better, and making a different choice. So that was good. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's all of that, right? It's seeing that there's something different besides, kids don't know. All we know is what we know, right? I mean, this is why people say you should travel and go to other cultures and meet people who are different from you. That's just a human condition, right? And so that importance of, you saw many of the parents say it was someone else's household. It was a teacher. It was a mentor. It could be a coach. It could be, any one of a number of people. I think it's also likely the pausing of the chaos. So, when he's describing being at someone else's house, that's a moment where the stress level can come way down, and that allows some of that healing, right? So it's both the lessons and it's the reduction of the chaos. And the more we can provide those spaces for kids that are less chaotic, they have a chance for that, for that brain. But also I would argue, like we know from the trauma literature, it's also a chance for those stress hormones to come back down again, right? So if we're thinking about, because it's part of what the video talks about, but doesn't use the language, really, are the dumps of those stress hormones. So the kids are getting a flood of those hormones that are, changing the way that their brains, literally they're changing their brains. And I think that opportunity for that to slow down. And I'm thinking about the kid that one of the kids they were showing, and this might relate to some of the kids you all were talking about. Part of what I've learned more recently in trauma studies is the need to release those stress hormones. And some of the ways to do that is physical activity or physical exertion. It gets the hormones out of the body, out of the bloodstream. Sometimes maybe throwing a tantrum might be that. And so I would be curious how you all think about or work with kids. I'm not suggesting that we want kids who are so disruptive in the classroom that other kids can't learn. But I sometimes wonder if for a little kid who's not verbal, a tantrum or not very verbal, a tantrum might be a way of releasing the stress hormones. And maybe in a controlled situation, that's actually okay. Or maybe we should be thinking about taking kids out and letting them run around the block or whatever, but express to get those hormones out of their system. I don't know what other folks see or hear or experience. Y'all have so much expertise in the room.
I just want to ask, this is Martha Proctor. I just wanted to ask, a child that has been exposed to domestic violence also can have learning disabilities, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, certainly, right. And I think part of the reason that we wanted to show this video is to really kind of shake up that myth that I know I hear it a lot in our work around domestic violence. Folks saying, well, the kids were asleep. They didn't hear it. The bedroom door was shut. And to understand that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not some impact. In fact, those might be the kids that we want to worry the most about, right? And is the domestic violence also co-occurring with substance abuse, mental health issues, incarceration, all, you know, racism, all the other things that these, you know, what's the circumstance outside the household? Is the child living in a neighborhood where they're also experiencing a lot of violence? And the more that those things are layered, the more difficult it's going to be, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Absolutely.
I just have one note, more of an experience than it is actually a comment about the video. But I had a teenager.
Oh, Brittany, for some reason you're on mute. Brittany, can you unmute yourself?
There we go.
Yeah, start over.
So it's okay. So from my experience, more so than a note from the video, but I've had a 15-year-old that witnessed domestic violence at a young age. Mother wasn't able to handle it with therapy at that moment, but then also the cycle continued with herself. She saw it as, and from what she stated, she saw how her mom thought I was type of love, and then she kind of fell into the same cycle of that's what she thought was love. So it's just more so, it was a great awareness to one, generational trauma, and also the trauma that continues the cycle. You see one thing, you do the same. So anybody that's working with teenagers, definitely was a great note to recognize and be aware of in the future for other cases, but also same thing when it comes to the physical nature of releasing those hormones that you were just saying, Angie. When she was in basketball, she was actually doing a lot better. And then once she got out of it, the season ended, things started to actually like really fall downhill, way worse than I thought. So definitely, I would say my note for future for kids in that nature that dealt with domestic violence as a kid is try to encourage some kind of sport activity or some kind of activity that gives them a hobby, gives them something good to look forward, and also exert all that cortisol and all that, those negative hormones in their body. But yeah, thank you for your presentation. It's been great.
Oh, no, thank you. And I mean, I think that you hit on so many important topics from, you know, the trauma literature tells us it can also be, you know, art, creative activities. So maybe the kid's not into sports, but they're into music or they're into some sort of other creative activity. And, you know, your example is so great too, because it also suggests there was another healthy adult in that person's life, right? Another person that's modeling a different kind of behavior. Maria Paula, I don't know if you want to say anything about intergenerational transmission.
Yeah, I mean, I was just now thinking of, I wanted to hear your examples too, but I have a lot of examples myself of what are other ways we can do to support these children. So what are these interventions that we can do to best support them? So I was thinking of healthy relationships, and, you know, because we talked about for that example of the kid who went to his friend's house to get dinner and saw like what a healthy family dynamic looked like. And so we need to have greater role models, model these healthy relationships and what that can look like. And so I know some schools have healthy relationships trainings and various workshops to show kids what an actual relationship, a loving relationship should look like that is free from abuse. And so I think I'm curious to see if any of you have any examples too of what either your children have told you, but what are these other ways that maybe in schools, school interventions that have taken place across Delaware, but other ways that you can provide greater support system for these kids to help model these positive relationships. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
The school I went to visit yesterday with my student that is very difficult to control, they have given him a big brother in the caretaker. So he's frequently running away, kicking the staff, but when he sees the caretaker, then the caretaker and he have time together and they do big brother and it just calms them all. I thought it was so clever of them. It's just because big brothers, big sisters are full. We can't get a big brother for him because there's a waiting list in Delaware. So, okay.
That's such a great example.
Any other examples you can think of? I mean, I'm just also thinking of, you know, greater education, parents' education, and just having more relationships with trusted adults, which I know that's what you all serve as well. But just having those people who you can turn to and talk about these things, I think is really important for those kids. I know in the video it talked about one of the biggest things you can do for that child is to let them talk about their feelings and talk about what they're experiencing or have experienced is really important for them.
So if I can add two things that's making me think of Mary Paula as you're talking about this, is, as CASAs, two things to kind of be aware of is to find out if you're a foster parent or whoever's providing care for the child is aware of the domestic violence history in the past. Remember, you aren't the one to tell the foster parent or the caregiver about them, but that's where we would involve the Division of Family Services social worker and have them explain the history so that the foster parents or whoever's providing care for the child is aware of that past experiences that the child has had and is a little bit more aware of their own behaviors and the way that they interact with their own spouse and whatnot, or own children or own, other adults kind of in the household. So that may be something that's a kind of a good example of things that caregivers should know about, that you can kind of facilitate that discussion around.
Yeah, absolutely.
And second would be, about kids wanting to talk. I know therapists are in short order, lately in Delaware, but that's definitely something if you think your kid might benefit from, speaking to a professional, that's where the Division of Family Services social worker will make a referral. But sometimes they may not see the need until you do. So that's definitely a quick way to be able to advocate, to speak up for a service that your youth might really benefit from.
I think those are such great examples, Lauren. And, I think obviously it's fantastic when we can get kids professionally trained staff and, experts. But also, I hope, and it's great to have had second invitation. I think the more comfortable we all are talking about it, we don't have to give advice. We don't have to diagnose. We can just listen. And if we're not afraid to listen, a whole lot of that sort of stuff that needs to happen when people talk about it can just be validated, right? I mean, I don't think it requires necessarily that we just need to not be afraid to ask the question or to listen. How did that make you feel? Wow, that must have been kind of scary. Do you want to talk about that? We don't have to have training to do that. We just have to be brave. I think that maybe that's also things you can do, or working with foster parents, for example, I think there's sometimes a misconception that if we ask someone about something that's troubling, we're going to make it worse. When in fact, it's not like our asking makes it real. It's already real. And so asking about it can often just open a window. Again, doesn't have to be we're not asking people to perform therapy, but just, simple, how did that make you feel? The trauma literature also suggests that human connection is so important. And you saw that in the video, that kids who grew up witnessing violence often they're so focused on survival that they have a difficult time making a connection. So they need adults in their life to be the ones making the connection. And it can be as simple as, just reaching out to a kid and saying, hey, I see you today. Like, how are you? Wow, that's a great shirt you're wearing. I mean, anything that we can do to make those human connections can really help.
Yeah, I think Sherry, in the comment you made in the chat, I think is a great example of that. Sherry says, I've mainly had young kids, but I noticed a huge difference in a young child whose foster parents spoke positive affirmations with them daily. So I think it's a great example of ways to, have that positive connection with foster children or their children.
Yeah. Other things you've tried or thought about, want to talk more about? I know the video can be depressing. I find it to be very hopeful, because although it's illustrating the harm that can happen, and it can happen in ways that we're not thinking about it. The fact that our brains can heal and change for the rest of our lives is pretty awesome. And if you've ever known anyone, for example, who's had a stroke or another kind of brain injury, you've seen that can happen, right? People can rebuild those neurons. And so, although the ACEs certainly suggest higher risk for stuff as kids grow up, it's never too late for an intervention. The intervention might be harder the older a child is and the more they've experienced, but it's never too late, right? It's never too late.
One of the things
Angie,
that I'll go. One of the things that struck me in the video was the mother talking about the baby and how the yelling and all that stuff that was going on in the household manifested itself when the child, even though the child slept, I mean, when they woke up, they were disturbed and they expressed themselves by the crying and all this stuff. And I mean, just to even think about that, because you think, oh, they're not hearing this, or even at that young age, the effects of that, the stress on them and the trauma is exhibited in some way. And even just to know that and to recognize that this time.
That's interesting you say that, Joyce. I had a casa a couple years ago that went to visit her kid for the first time in the foster home, and we, was just kind of introducing herself and getting to know the foster parents and the child. And the foster parent said, the child's doing okay, but the child cannot sleep unless there is constant loud noise in the bedroom, like when they're sleeping. And I thought that was, the casa said that was really interesting because the child, who was a young child, just felt more comfortable with loud noise. So it was the foster parents were trying to make that happen without waking everybody else in the house as well. But that's what identified their comfort. So I don't know, that just made me think of that.
No, that's so interesting. And, who knows, right? But it might have also been that the child, other kinds of loud noise were the things that were the distraction. So the kid who numbs out by putting on the headphones and playing a video game or whatever. But I think that, that's part of why, thank you, Joyce, for sharing that. We thought it was so important because it's the kids that we're not thinking about, right? The kids who we think are not in the line of fire, so to speak, are the ones who may actually be experiencing the most trauma. And also just to reinforce and over reinforce and keep reinforcing, it doesn't have to be physical. Right? A lot of the trauma that the kids are experiencing can be the verbal fighting. It can be even not abusive, but just chaotic experiences that feel they don't engender safety, right? They engender a feeling of I'm at risk. And that's what shuts down the thinking brain and turns on, the basic brain, the reptilian brain, if you will, the survival brain. So I hope just knowing some of that helps you think differently or helps you think about those homes that you're going into and the kids that you're working with.
This was very helpful for me, particularly knowing that the 6-month-old hearing the noise could have been more negatively affected than the 2 older children. I never would have thought of that.
Yeah, thank you.
I thought it was interesting too. I always love hearing Dr. Bruce Perry talk, but and he said that children who experience the non-physical, but like the domestic violence at such a young age, struggle more than children that are physically abused. I thought that I was not expecting that.
And what's interesting is that also aligns with what many victim survivors tell us, is that the physical abuse, is of course hard and horrible and can feel life-threatening, but it's the emotional and psychological abuse that they often talk about had the biggest impact. And I think part of that, what I've heard victim survivors say about that is, and I think that this is probably what's also happening for kids, is that the physical abuse, you can see it, other people validate it, it heals. You can see the healing, you can see the bruises change color, you can see the broken bones mend. Everyone's sort of in agreement about that, and we can talk about it. But it's a lot harder with the verbal and emotional and psychological abuse because we don't label it necessarily as that. People don't, there's a great, if you haven't seen the Netflix show Made, I highly recommend it. It's a 10-part show that watches the struggle of a woman trying to leave an abusive household. And in the first episode, she arrives at the social worker's office and she's, the social worker says, well, did you report it? And she says, what? Call the police and say he didn't hit me. And I think that's what's going on, right? Is that we don't have a shared agreement as a culture or a society or group of people that that's abusive behavior. So it's hard to label, it's hard to talk about. And what I hear victim survivors say all the time is, I can play the tape over and over and over again in my head. I can hear those abusive remarks being said. And that, I think, is what we're also seeing with kids. They can replay that fight between their caregivers or the parent or, you know, the language. They can replay that over and over again. And you can't sort of, it doesn't heal in the same way. Not to say we can't heal it. I think that's sort of the point of these lunch and learns, right? Is the more we know, the more we can engage in the interventions that facilitate the healing.
So Angie, I also want to note on that, it's I appreciate your message of hope from that video, because I see the same thing of that, you know, we're dealing with a situation that's in front of us, but what can we change, making sure it's different going forward. I will say there was one thing I actually attended as an adult last week. It was called a stress and recovery seminar. And they made a very good point, which I want to integrate also my CASA work, is intentional recovery. And that's 1, 5, and 15 minutes. So find activities within 1 minute, or multiple in 5 minutes, multiple in 15 minutes. And to teach your child, it's just simple as what we already most likely know is deep breaths. What can we do to be proactive versus reactive when it comes to stress and recovery? As long as we can teach that teach our children younger, it will help that coping part and also help rebuild those neurons that we're talking about in that video. So I appreciate your message. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Great examples, Brittany. Are you all familiar with what she was talking about in terms of, was that a CASA training that you had?
It was not. It was actually a training at my work. So I should probably extend a little bit more. Intentional recovery is activities that you can commit to on a daily basis or weekly basis, good, better, and best, whatever that may look like for you, to take a moment, mental health wise, step away from any activity you have, especially when it comes to external stressors, volume, intensity, and perception of all of those, which kids cannot necessarily control, but they can control beforehand or after when it comes to recovery. But go ahead, Angie, if you have more, please extend.
No. I wanted to hear from you. That's those are all great tools, right? And I think that this is the space for that, is to share these tools, right?
Absolutely. Let's teach our kids, to do something different than they know and help their mental health before things do happen. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And someone put in the chat that you read Made. Did the CASAs read it as a team? Oh, fantastic. Any thoughts about that? I mean, we have 2 minutes. But...
I think that series was awesome. I think everybody should watch that. There's so many great examples of what a domestic violent partner and also child and what they experience at different perceptions and the battles and issues that come across it. That was a great series. If no one's watched it or read it, please do so. It's very helpful.
I strongly encourage it too. And we picked it as I didn't, but it was picked as the common read for UD incoming students this year. And that's the first time I'd read it, was this summer. And I will say, I think the book is really fantastic, but the book is more focused on social class inequality and poverty and struggles and less on domestic violence. And I feel like the Netflix series focuses a bit more on domestic violence. So I wouldn't say they're not surprisingly as overlapping as I thought they might be. Lot to learn from both of them, I would say, in my experience. Did other people I'm hearing some nods?
Well, the series definitely expressed the domestic violence and the consequences of the woman leaving. Where is she going? What is she winding up in? Does she have resources to make it on her own? I think that came out pretty clear and very as one of the big important things that women experience who leave their abusive partner.
Yep. And you might also rewatch some of that or reread it and think about Maddie, the daughter, in light of the video that we just watched, and think, how do we need to think about Maddie? And I think her mom is doing all the right things that the video suggested, right?
But she always had to go back and try to keep that relationship with her dad also. Remember, she kept, they had set up visitation, but he would try to pit her against the mom. I read the book, but I didn't see the Netflix series. I think I started to watch the Netflix series And that was more of the domestic violence part of it. And I didn't really want to watch that. So I read the book, but I found the book to be a lot more hopeful, a lot more, it didn't, I mean, I guess it was just the visual. Whereas in the book, I can just do the reading and not really see the visual. So that made a difference. But I think maybe I'll go back and watch the Netflix just to get a different perspective also.
Awesome.
Can I ask you what you had in there? Stat, STATS in the beginning.
Oh,
Stat. What is that?
We just wanted to note things like that Maria Paula's statistics about the disproportionate risk for ending up in
and stats. Okay, the statistics regarding that. Okay, I got it.
Sorry, shorthand.
Okay.
Awesome. So in the interest of time, we'll wrap it up. But I love Angie, kind of referring to hope. It's not too late. There are things we can do as CASAs. So kind of our takeaways would be, I love what Brittany just shared about intentional recovery. I might ask you about some more information about that. Maybe we could do a training next year. But just, utilize some methods, talk to your youth, engage with the foster parents, explore some physical activities, maybe, or art activities. Some we'll call it extracurricular activities. And I'll mention for anybody that has a Sussex kid with a Sussex judge, Friends of Sussex CASA has the enrichment program that will spend up to $250 per year on a kid. And that would include sports equipment or registration or music and music classes, instruments, things like that. And then if your kid is in Kent or Newcastle County, you contact your coordinator. We will figure out, how to utilize some funds from Office of the Child Advocate. But there are ways that our programs can support these kids if there's a need, if there's a way for them to engage in some kind of enrichment activity.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So with that, Angie and Maria Paula, any final words?
Maria Paula, you got anything?
Yeah, I'll go first. When I heard stats, we're talking about statistics. If anyone's interested, we do have an Instagram that we use, and we do post a lot of statistics on that. So I'll throw in our Instagram username in the chat if anyone wants to follow us on Instagram. And sometimes we do events like this, and so just so you can see it on there to follow us on Instagram if you would like. But thank you so much for letting me join you today.
Same thing, and thank you for having us, and thank you for the work that you do, because you are the ones on the ground implementing all of the stuff that we're talking about today. So pat yourselves on the back, give yourselves a round of applause. What you do is mind-blowing and fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.